Some weeks don't fall apart. They quietly empty you. You kept showing up. You kept believing. You kept going even when your heart felt heavy. If this week took more from you than you expected, stay with me. You're not leaving empty-handed. When a week takes more than it gives, there are weeks in life that do not arrive with chaos or visible disasters, yet they weigh heavily on the heart in ways that are difficult to explain. Nothing outwardly falls apart. Responsibilities continue. Conversations still happen, and people around you may never notice that something inside you feels slower, heavier, and more exhausted than usual. You move through your days doing what is required of you, fulfilling obligations, responding to others, and trying to keep your faith steady. But by the time the week ends, you feel as though something has been quietly drained from you. What makes these weeks particularly difficult is that there is no clear moment you can point to and say, this is when it all became too much. Instead, the heaviness builds slowly. It settles into your chest while you are trying to focus. It follows you into moments of prayer, and it lingers in the silence when the day finally ends. You may even begin to question yourself, wondering why you feel so tired when you did not stop trying, why your heart feels burdened even though you did not give up. Many people assume that strength always feels powerful, but in reality, strength often feels like quiet endurance. It feels like continuing when enthusiasm is gone, remaining patient when relief feels delayed, and holding on to faith even when emotions are low. These are the moments when a person carries more than they realize. And because that weight is invisible, it is rarely acknowledged by others. If this week felt heavy in that quiet, unexplainable way, it does not mean you are weak. And it does not mean you have done something wrong. It means you have been carrying responsibilities, emotions, and hopes that required more patience than you expected. Recognizing this is important because it allows you to understand that what you are feeling is not failure, but the natural result of giving your best while facing unseen challenges. And as this reminder continues, it is important to remember that a heavy week does not end without purpose. Even when it feels like nothing has changed on the surface, something meaningful has already begun to take shape within you, and understanding that truth will help you see why you are not leaving this moment empty-handed. The weight you carried was never meaningless. When a week feels heavy, the mind often tries to convince the heart that the effort was wasted, that patience went unnoticed, and that endurance without immediate relief holds no value. This is one of the most exhausting thoughts a person can carry because it makes struggle feel pointless and turns perseverance into self-doubt. You begin to replay the week in your head, questioning moments where you stayed silent instead of reacting, times when you held your emotions back, and nights when you went to sleep tired but still hopeful, wondering whether any of it mattered at all. What many people do not realize is that heaviness itself is not always a sign of loss. Sometimes it is a sign that something important is being formed beneath the surface. Growth rarely announces itself loudly, and strength is often built in moments where the heart feels stretched beyond comfort. The quiet patience you showed, the restraint you practiced, and the trust you maintained despite exhaustion were not random acts. They were responses to a test that required maturity rather than visible success. This is why the Quran speaks directly to moments like these, reminding the believer that weight and difficulty are never placed without purpose. Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 286, لا يكلف لله نفسا إلا وسعها, which means Allah does not burden a soul beyond what it can bear. This verse is not merely a comforting statement, it is a declaration of truth that reframes how hardship should be understood. If this week demanded patience from you, then patience was already within your capacity. If it required endurance, then endurance existed inside you before the test arrived. The weight you carried was measured, intentional, and suited specifically to your strength, even if it did not feel that way while you were living through it. Often, the most painful part of a heavy week is not the struggle itself, but the fear that you are facing it alone or that your effort is unseen. Yet the reality is that every quiet moment of restraint, every tear held back, and every time you chose faith over frustration was accounted for. Nothing was random and nothing was overlooked. The value of what you carried cannot always be measured immediately because some gains are not meant to be visible yet. Understanding this changes the way you look back on the week. Instead of seeing only exhaustion, you begin to see evidence of inner strength. Instead of assuming loss, you recognize preparation. And instead of believing that the heaviness meant emptiness, you begin to realize that something meaningful was placed into your heart during the struggle, even if you have not fully felt it yet. As we move forward, it becomes clear that heaviness is not the end of the story. It is often the middle, the shaping point, the quiet phase where patience is turned into something lasting, and where what you carried begins to reveal why you were never meant to leave empty-handed. What you lost this week was never the real loss. One of the quiet dangers of a heavy week is that it convinces you something important has been taken from you. You begin to feel as though energy has been drained, motivation has slipped away, and joy has become distant, and slowly the heart starts believing that loss is the final outcome of endurance. This is where exhaustion becomes emotional, because it does not just tire the body, it begins to rewrite the story you tell yourself about your own strength and worth. But there is a difference between feeling empty and actually being empty. What often disappears during difficult weeks is not faith, not value, and not purpose, but the surface emotions that once made things feel light and easy. When those emotions fade, what remains is the core of who you truly are. This is the part of you that continues without applause, that believes without comfort, and that stands without reassurance. Most people never meet this version of themselves because life rarely slows down enough to strip everything else away. When ease is removed, clarity begins to form. You start noticing what truly matters and what was only noise. You realize how much effort you were giving to things that never gave anything back, and how much strength you were carrying without recognition. A heavy week forces honesty upon the heart, and while that honesty can be uncomfortable, it is also deeply transformative. It reveals which connections are genuine, which habits are sustainable, and which expectations were quietly exhausting you. There is also a hidden exchange that takes place during weeks like this. While it may feel like you lost peace or stability, what you were actually given was discernment. You learned where your limits are, what drains you unnecessarily, and what deserves more of your attention. These lessons do not arrive gently, because gentle moments rarely change direction. They arrive through pressure, through silence, and through the kind of tiredness that makes reflection unavoidable. This is why weeks like these are often misunderstood. They feel like setbacks, but in reality, they are moments of refinement. Just as something valuable is shaped through pressure rather than ease, the heart is strengthened through experiences that demand patience without explanation. What you carried this week was not just responsibility or emotion, but growth that could not have occurred any other way. If you feel different now than you did before the week began, that difference is not damage. It is awareness. It is depth. It is the result of surviving something quietly and emerging with a clearer sense of self and purpose. You did not lose who you were, you uncovered who you are beneath the surface. And as this reminder continues, it becomes important to understand that what you are feeling now is not the end of the process. It is the turning point where heaviness begins to transform into meaning, and where the weight you carried starts to reveal why it was never meant to leave you empty, but rather to leave you changed in ways that will soon make sense. Why relief often arrives after the heaviest moments. One of the hardest truths to accept during a heavy period is that relief rarely arrives when the heart demands it most. When the weight feels unbearable, the mind expects an immediate shift, a sudden lightness, or a clear sign that the struggle has served its purpose. Yet very often, nothing changes right away. The days continue, responsibilities remain, and the heart wonders whether endurance is being mistaken for delay. This is where discouragement quietly enters. Not because faith is lost, but because patience has been stretched for longer than expected. What many people do not realize is that relief is not always designed to interrupt difficulty. Sometimes it is designed to follow it. There are moments when the heart must first learn how to stand under pressure before it is allowed to rest. If comfort arrived too quickly, the depth of growth would be lost, and the strength that comes from perseverance would never fully form. The heaviness you felt was not meant to crush you, but but to steady you, to teach you how to remain grounded even when answers are not immediate. There is a wisdom in delayed relief that only becomes visible in hindsight. It teaches the heart how to remain sincere without reward, how to continue doing what is right without reassurance, and how to trust without constantly seeking signs. These lessons are uncomfortable because they remove emotional dependence and replace it with quiet certainty. Over time, this certainty becomes a source of peace that is not shaken by circumstances because it is rooted deeper than surface emotions. Often, the most meaningful changes do not announce themselves with dramatic shifts. They unfold gradually, shaping perspective rather than circumstances. You may notice that you react differently than you once did, that certain worries no longer control your thoughts, or that you feel calmer even though the situation has not fully resolved. These are not coincidences. They are signs that endurance has already begun to do its work within you. A heavy week tests whether faith is conditional or constant. It asks whether belief depends on ease or remains steady through uncertainty. By continuing to move forward despite exhaustion, you answered that question without words. You demonstrated a level of trust that does not rely on immediate comfort, and that kind of trust reshapes the heart in lasting ways. As time passes, you may realize that what once felt like delay was actually preparation. The heart that emerges after hardship is more discerning, more patient, and less easily shaken. It understands that relief is not always about changing what surrounds you, but about strengthening what resides within you. And when relief finally does arrive, it is received with gratitude rather than entitlement, because the journey has taught you its true value. This is why moments of heaviness should never be rushed or dismissed. They are not empty spaces meant to be filled with frustration, but meaningful intervals where resilience is formed and clarity begins to take shape. You may not feel lighter yet, but you are standing on the threshold of understanding why the weight you carried was never without purpose, and why what comes next will feel different because of what you endured when nothing changed, but everything was being rearranged. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes when you realize that despite everything you carried, everything you endured, and everything you held back, the situation itself did not change. The problem is still there, the uncertainty still exists, and the answers you hoped for have not yet arrived. This is the moment where many people begin to question the value of patience, because the heart naturally expects visible results as proof that endurance mattered. When those results do not appear, discouragement quietly whispers that effort was wasted and that strength went unnoticed. But this assumption is where the heart misunderstands what truly happened during the week you just survived. Not all change is meant to appear in the form of solutions. Some change is meant to occur within the person who is walking through the difficulty. While your eyes were focused on outcomes, something far more important was taking place beneath the surface. Your priorities were being reordered, your expectations were being softened, and your heart was being detached from things that were silently draining you long before this week began. There are moments in life when nothing around you moves forward because you are the one being moved into a new position internally. Your way of thinking, your emotional responses, and your understanding of what truly matters begin to shift. This kind of transformation does not feel rewarding at first because it does not come with relief or celebration. Instead, it comes with tiredness, silence, and a strange sense of stillness that feels uncomfortable because it removes distractions and forces reflection. During heavy weeks, the heart is often stripped of its illusions. You start to see which expectations were unrealistic, which attachments were unhealthy, and which hopes were placing too much pressure on your emotional well-being. This awareness can feel painful because it requires letting go of versions of the future you imagined would unfold differently. However, this release is not loss, it is alignment. It is the process of being guided away from what was never meant to carry the weight of your happiness. One of the most difficult lessons to accept is that effort does not always produce immediate ease, but it always produces growth. Every time you chose restraint instead of reaction, Every time you remained patient instead of bitter, and every time you continued despite feeling empty, you were reinforcing a version of yourself that is far more resilient than you realize. This resilience is not loud, and it does not seek recognition, but it becomes the foundation upon which lasting peace is built. Heavy weeks also reveal how much you have been giving without replenishing yourself. They expose emotional habits that go unnoticed during easier times, such as overextending compassion, neglecting rest, or carrying burdens that were never meant to be yours alone. Feeling drained is often not a sign of weakness, but a signal that boundaries need to be redefined and that care must be extended inward as much as it is offered outward. There is also a quiet mercy in exhaustion, because it slows the heart down enough to recognize its limits. It reminds you that you are human, that you were not created to carry everything effortlessly, and that asking for support, even silently, is not failure. The heaviness you felt was not meant to harden you. It was meant to soften your understanding of yourself and others. As the week unfolded, you may have noticed moments where your patience surprised you, where your reactions were calmer than before, or where your faith remained steady despite emotional fatigue. These moments are not insignificant. They are signs that endurance is shaping you into someone who can face future challenges with greater clarity and composure. What you practice during this difficult period will become instinctive during the next, making you stronger without requiring the same level of struggle. When nothing seems to change externally, it is easy to overlook the fact that endurance itself is a form of progress. Remaining intact while carrying weight is not stagnation, it is movement through resistance. Much like walking against a strong current, progress is measured not by speed but by the ability to keep moving forward without being swept away. You did not stop, you did not give up, and that alone speaks volumes about what was being built inside you. Eventually, there will come a moment when you look back at this week and realize that it marked a turning point you could not recognize at the time. The clarity you gained, the strength you developed, and the awareness that formed will begin to guide your decisions in ways that feel natural rather than forced. What once felt heavy will begin to feel meaningful, and what once felt empty will reveal itself as preparation. This is why you are not leaving empty-handed. Even if you cannot name what you gained, yet it exists. It lives in the patience you practiced, the restraint you showed, and the faith you protected during moments of exhaustion. These are not temporary traits. They become part of who you are moving forward. And when the next chapter of your life begins to unfold, you will step into it with a depth and steadiness that could only have been shaped by the weight you carried this week. The quiet signs that heaviness is beginning to lift. There comes a stage after prolonged heaviness where the heart does not suddenly feel light, but it begins to feel steadier. The weight does not disappear all at once, yet it no longer presses in the same suffocating way. This is often overlooked because people expect relief to feel dramatic, immediate, and obvious. In reality, true relief often begins subtly, almost unnoticed, through small shifts in perception and emotional response, rather than through instant changes in circumstance. You may begin to notice that your thoughts are not as restless as before, that moments of calm appear briefly even in the middle of unresolved problems, or that your reactions are softer than they once were. These signs may seem insignificant at first, but they are deeply meaningful. They indicate that the heart has absorbed the lessons of endurance and is no longer fighting the experience, but learning from it. Acceptance begins to replace resistance, and with that acceptance comes a quiet sense of inner balance. One of the clearest indicators that heaviness is lifting is when the heart stops demanding immediate answers and starts trusting the process instead. This does not mean that you no longer care about outcomes or that difficulties have lost their importance. It means that anxiety no longer controls your sense of peace. You begin to understand that not everything needs to be resolved at once for life to continue meaningfully, and that waiting does not have to feel like suffering when it is accompanied by trust. There is a profound strength in reaching this stage, because it reflects emotional maturity that can only be gained through experience. You have learned how to sit with discomfort without letting it define you. You have learned how to move forward even when clarity is incomplete. These abilities are not taught through ease. They are formed through moments where faith is practiced quietly without reassurance or recognition. As the steadiness grows, the heart becomes more discerning. You begin to recognize which worries deserve your energy and which ones can be released. You become less reactive to external pressures and more grounded in what truly matters. This discernment is one of the most valuable outcomes of a heavy period because it protects your peace long after the situation itself has changed. Another sign that relief is approaching is when gratitude starts to reappear naturally, not because circumstances have improved, but because perspective has deepened. You begin to appreciate moments of rest, clarity, or connection that may have gone unnoticed before. Gratitude at this stage is not forced optimism. It is the quiet recognition that even within difficulty, there is still goodness present. This awareness gently shifts the emotional weight from despair to cautious hope. It is also during this stage that trust becomes more personal. Rather than relying on expectations of how things should unfold, the heart learns to rely on the belief that outcomes will arrive in the right time and form. This trust does not remove challenges, but it removes the fear that challenges are meaningless. You start to feel less alone in your struggle, even if the path ahead remains uncertain. What is important to understand is that this quiet lifting of heaviness is not a sign that the journey is over, but that you are no longer walking it in the same way. You are carrying wisdom now instead of confusion, patience instead of panic, and steadiness instead of desperation. These internal changes may not be visible to others, but they are deeply felt within you, and they change how you experience everything that comes next. As you move forward from this point, the memory of the heavy week will remain, but it will no longer weigh you down. Instead, it will remind you of how far you have come, how much you were able to endure, and how strength quietly formed when you thought you were simply surviving. This realization brings a sense of calm that cannot be taken away easily, because it is rooted in lived experience rather than temporary comfort. And as this calm settles into your heart, it becomes easier to believe what once felt difficult to accept, that the heaviness you carried was not a sign of being abandoned, but a stage of preparation, and that the relief unfolding now, however quietly, is proof that patience was never misplaced and that you are steadily moving toward a place of greater peace and clarity. Why you were never meant to leave this season empty. There comes a moment after long patience where the heart no longer asks why the journey was difficult, but begins to understand why it had to unfold exactly the way it did. This understanding does not arrive suddenly, nor does it feel like an emotional explosion. Instead, it settles quietly, like a truth the heart has finally grown ready to carry. You begin to realize that what you thought was a delay was actually a process, and what you believed was emptiness was actually preparation happening beyond your awareness. Throughout this heavy period, you were being shaped in ways that could not have happened during ease. Ease comforts, but difficulty transforms. Ease allows life to flow smoothly, but struggle forces reflection, sincerity, and depth. If things had unfolded quickly, if answers had arrived early, and if relief had come without resistance, you would never have developed the patience, insight, and emotional strength that now exist within you. What you endured was not random, and it was not excessive. It was tailored specifically to who you are becoming. Many people measure progress by visible changes, but the most powerful growth is often invisible. While you were waiting for circumstances to improve, your heart was learning how to remain steady without guarantees. While you hoped for clarity, your faith was learning how to exist without constant reassurance. These are not small achievements. They are foundations. They determine how you will handle future blessings, responsibilities, and challenges long after this season has passed. You may not feel victorious, and that is because real victory is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like quiet endurance. Sometimes it feels like continuing even when motivation fades. Sometimes it is choosing patience over bitterness, trust over fear, and calm over reaction. Every time you made one of these choices, even silently, something was added to you. You were accumulating strength in a way that cannot be taken away because it was earned through experience rather than given through comfort. It is also important to understand that not every season is meant to feel rewarding while you are inside it. Some seasons only make sense once you have moved beyond them. Only then do you see how certain doors closing protected you, how certain delays redirected you, and how certain struggles prevented you from settling for less than what you were capable of carrying. The clarity you gain later is the evidence that the heaviness was purposeful, not punishing. As you reach the end of this reminder, take a moment to recognize how much you survived without applause, without certainty, and without ease. You did not collapse under the weight. You adapted, you learned, you grew. And even if you still feel tired, that tiredness now carries meaning. It is the exhaustion of someone who walked through difficulty with dignity rather than the emptiness of someone who gave up. The truth is that you are leaving this week with more than you arrived with, even if you cannot list it yet. You are leaving with a deeper understanding of yourself, a stronger sense of patience, and a faith that has been tested and refined rather than weakened. These are not temporary gifts. They will influence how you move forward, how you respond to challenges, and how you receive future ease. One day, perhaps sooner than you expect, you will look back on this period and realize that it marked a turning point. Not because everything suddenly improved, but because you did. Your perspective widened, your priorities clarified, and your heart became less dependent on circumstances for peace. That shift will carry you through moments that once would have overwhelmed you, and you will wonder how you ever doubted the value of what you endured. So if you still feel the weight of this week, let it rest differently now. Let it rest as proof that you were trusted with a journey that required strength, patience, and sincerity. Let it remind you that you were not abandoned, overlooked, or forgotten, but carefully guided through a season that prepared you for what comes next. You are not leaving empty-handed. You are leaving strengthened. You are leaving wiser. You are leaving with a heart that has been shaped by endurance rather than broken by hardship. And that is something no difficult week can ever take away from you. Before you move on, pause for a moment and acknowledge something important. You just listened to words meant for a heart that has been carrying more than it shows. That alone means this moment was not accidental. Sometimes reminders arrive not to fix everything immediately, but to steady you enough to keep going with clarity and trust. You may still have unanswered questions, you may still be waiting for certain doors to open, but what matters most right now is that you are not walking forward the same way you were before. You are leaving with a heart that understands patience more deeply, with a strength that was earned quietly, and with a calm that comes from knowing that heaviness is never meaningless. Carry this reminder with you into the days ahead. Let it soften the pressure you place on yourself. Let it remind you that progress is not always visible and that endurance itself is a form of growth. Even if nothing around you changes immediately, something within you already has. And when you feel that familiar weight return, remember this moment. Remember that you were reminded, reassured, and strengthened when you needed it most. You were never empty. And you were never forgotten. Take this peace with you. Move forward gently and trust that what is unfolding will make sense in time. Allah, you know the weight this heart has been carrying in silence. You know the patience that was shown when answers did not come, the strength that was held together when ease felt distant, and the faith that remained even when emotions felt low. For every tired heart listening right now, bring calm where there is restlessness, bring clarity where there is confusion, and bring light where the path feels uncertain. Replace heaviness with reassurance, replace waiting with trust, and replace exhaustion with a peace that settles deeply within. Grant relief that arrives at the right time, strength that does not fade, and hope that remains steady no matter the circumstances. And for every soul that held on quietly, reward them in ways they could never imagine and make what they endured a reason for ease ahead. Ameen.